Hey folks, welcome back for another episode of Code Club. In today's episode, we are going back to my favorite source of data visualizations, the New York Times. I just really like the style and the appearance of the visualizations in the New York Times. Also, they don't do too much polishing of the data, and so it's relatively straightforward for me to go out, get the data, and then bring it into R and then try to recreate what they've done. Obviously, because it's a news website, they do a pretty good job of staying current in what is interesting or not to people. And right now, people are really interested in what's going on with the United States, the economy, and the Trump presidency. So this visualization is coming to us again from the New York Times. And I thought it was really interesting because at the time when I put this in a newsletter, which again, if you go down below in the description for today's episode, you can get a link to go ahead and register for that newsletter where I talk about how I would build visualizations such as this one, but doing it at like a much higher level than I do here, right? And so in the newsletter, I talk about strategy, and here I talk about more specific tactics that I would use to go about recreating this. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to recreate this visualization. This article was published, as you can see, April 4th. And so it was right before the latest round of Trump tariff craziness, right? This is showing the change in the S&P 500. The S&P 500 is a collection of stocks that do a pretty good job of representing the overall US economy. And this data goes back to the beginning of the year. Trump was inaugurated right around here, January 20th. And so you can see things were pretty steady, and then things got rocky, came back, and then got really rocky, right? And so again, this doesn't go out beyond the end of March. Here we are now at the end of April. And so I'd be curious to see what this visualization looks like going through the end of April. But we'll get there eventually. But for now, I want to recreate this visual. It has a couple interesting things going on with it. So first of all, it has different blocks for each week, right? And so this rectangle, this orange rectangle, shows the 5 days of that week. Other weeks, like the 20th, has 4 days because in the United States, that Monday was Martin Luther King Day, so it's a holiday, right? And so there's some other, I think, 4-day weeks in here somewhere, but right here, right at the middle of February, which I think was President's Day. Regardless, we have separate lines for each week of the being considered here, right? Another thing that we have going on in the background of each week is that, as you can see from the subtitle, the orange bars indicate weekly losses from end of previous week. And so if you look at this week, starting February 3rd, you'll see that the week loss, basically the close of this week, is lower than the close of the previous week, right? Whereas if we look at this week that started on January 20th, it closed higher than the close of the previous week, right? And so I thought it was really interesting that they could color in the background. And so I'm interested to see how I would do that with R, as well as how we can put in these breaks between the different weeks. Then finally, I'm interested in building this out so that whenever you're watching this video, you could recreate the video going forward to wherever you are, right? So perhaps the end of March, beginning of April was just a horrible nightmare and everything came back to normal. Or maybe it got worse, or maybe it stayed the same. We'll see. Anyway, we're going to go ahead and build this, and we are going to bring in data from the S&P 500 to seed our data so that we have real data that we are going to be working with in this episode. As always, if you want to get a hold of the code that I am generating in today's episode, go down below in the description. There'll be a link to a blog post where you can get all of the code. I am starting here with maybe 10 or so lines of code, bringing in the tidyverse as well as show text. We'll use Libre Franklin for our sans serif font and Domine for the serif font. Again, the title here is a serifed font, as is the subtitle, but every other bit of text in here is a sans serif font, pretty similar to Franklin. And the Times has a very specific font, but Domine does a decent job of approximating what this looks like. Finally, I have a ggSave statement that will save my version of the image into an aspect ratio that is pretty similar to what they had in theirs. And so again, this is the visual that I will be trying to go about recreating. So the first thing I want to do is go ahead and bring in the S&P 500 data. So the package that we're going to use to bring in data from the stock exchange is called quantmod. And so quantmod will allow you to bring in basically any stock ticker, stock symbol that you want and get data for varying ranges of time. Because this is a package you might not have, let's go ahead and see how we'd install it. Again, here in packages, you could do quantmod and then install, and this then will obviously install the package. While it's doing that, I'll come up here and do library quantmod. So to figure out how to use quantmod, we could either look at the documentation, some examples, the gallery. Let's look at the gallery for real quick here. And so this is basically showing a variety of plots. Not interested in that. Let's look at examples. Examples are always really helpful. I see here, get symbols, right? So you could do get symbols Yahoo. And so this then will get the data from Google, but I don't know. So if we go ahead and run that, we see that Google Finance stopped providing data. So let's look at this other one where we get the source from Yahoo. So we'll go ahead and run that. This then gets the symbol for Goog. And so if we look at the help for get symbols, we see that it allows us to give the symbols as well as a variety of other options here. And so I believe that get symbols will get us the stock data, but that it doesn't automatically show us all the data. So if I do x equals get symbols Goog, and I do str on x, well, I get that, right? So the data from Google is not getting stored to x. However, what I see up in my environment is that there is an object now called Goog, which is a time series data frame, right? So I believe what I want to modify is the auto assign argument. So let's see what that does down here further below. And so it says, should results be loaded into the environment, like we saw here? If false, return results instead, right? If I instead do get symbol on Goog, and I then do auto assign equals false, then this is going to output the data frame. And so that's great. That's what we want to do. Something I'm not so sure about is what is the stock ticker for the S&P 500. So if I go to finance.yahoo.com, and then I look up here at, say, like the S&P 500, I see the symbol that it's using is a caret and then GSPC. So if I go ahead and copy that and then do get symbols, and then I plop that in, and I again do auto assign equals false, this is then going to bring in all of the S&P 500 data for me. This goes back to 2007. And so we're going to want to focus on data from the beginning of 2025. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves because, again, this is coming in as an XTC, which is a time series document, and it also has the dates as the row names. I want this to be a tibble with the dates as their own column in date format. So I'm going to go ahead and take get symbols and then pipe this to as underscore tibble. Then I can do row names equals date. And I think I forgot to load everything. Oh my. I got so excited to get going that I forgot to load my packages. Great, that worked. We now get those row names to be in the date column, but it's being formatted as a character type rather than as a date type. And then we see all this other data, right? We're going to want this GSPC close for the closing value of the S&P 500 for any given date. So let's go ahead then and think about how we might modify that date to be a date rather than a character. Well, we can mutate date using parse date and then put into that date. And so this date is already in the ISO standard that R likes to use. So if we run that, we now see that date is in the date format for a column. Cool. We're moving right along. Let's go ahead and simplify this a bit by doing select, and we'll do date, and then I'll do close equals gspc.close. And this gives us our 2-column data frame. So I don't want all the data going back to 2007. And for now, I don't want all the data coming to the end of April here, right? So let's go ahead and put in a filter statement, and we'll do date greater than, and we'll do 2025-01-01. And so now we see that our data starts with January 2nd. Cool. And actually, maybe I'll make that greater than or equal to, so that if there are data for January 1st, we'll get it. That's also a holiday, so we're not going to get it. then I'm also going to cap the date to be as of April 4th, right? Which is when the authors were looking at their data. So we'll do 2025, 0404. And if I do last value and pipe that to tail, then I see that that will go through April 4th. Very good. So now what we could do is we could go ahead and think about piping this to ggplot, AES, and on the x-axis we'll do date, y, let's go ahead and do close, and then we'll go ahead and do geom line, and then geom point. Very good. We now have our line plot here on the right, and we see that we do have a bit of work to do to have it look like theirs, but we'll get there, don't worry. The first thing that I want to do to make ours look more like theirs is that they don't draw a line spanning the weekends, right? So like you can see right here, there's a big jump, and of course that's over a weekend, and there's no data there, right? And so the strategy I'm going to take is to make each week its own group. And so with geom line, we can have a group aesthetic to basically say, these points all go together, connect the dots. These points all go together, connect the dots. So how are we going to tell ggplot, or how are we going to basically figure out the week? Well, there are a variety of week functions from the lubridate package that comes to us with tidyverse. So we're going to use that to make a column called week, and then we'll use the group aesthetic to equal the week. So if we go ahead and do $week, we now see that there are 3 week functions, right? There's week, which returns the number of complete 7-day periods that have occurred between the date and January 1st, +1. The ISO week returns the week as it would appear in the ISO system, which uses a reoccurring leap week. And then epi week, which is the US CDC version of epidemiological week. It basically follows the same rules as ISO week, but starts on Sunday. So if we were to think about our data, and so let's go ahead and break this apart and not worry about plotting it just yet. And then we were to do a mutate and do week equals week on date. And then let's also do ISO week equals ISO week on date. And then epi week equals epi week on date. So again, the week starts on the 1st of the year, January 1st, and counts out, right? And so versus ISO week starts things on a Monday, I believe, right? And then epi week starts things on a Sunday. And so ISO week and epi week are going to give us the same result, but they're going to be different from week. And so what we're going to want is ISO week to calculate the week of the year. So I'm going to go ahead and make this then ISO week on date. And now when we run that, we get the week as our 3rd column here, right? And so again, we could come in here and then we could do group equals week. So I'm going to clean up my code a little bit here because, let's see, I'm going to move my week statement back up here to this mutate statement because I don't need to have all these mutates laying around, and it's nice to have simple, short code, but without losing any of the expressiveness of the code. And I left a week out of my select, so let's go ahead and move that up before the mutate. Now when we run things, now what we get is a separate line plot for each week of data that we have. Now what I want to do is go ahead and put in the rectangles behind my data. Let's start by using the theme function to get rid of the grid lines as well as the background. So we'll do panel.grid equals element blank. That gets rid of those grid lines. And then if we do panel.background equals element blank, that gets rid of the background. Cool. Again, now we want to put in rectangles for the background. But we want to color those rectangled backgrounds based on whether the losses from the previous week, right? So basically, does this week close at a level lower than the close of the previous week? So we need to get the final closing value for each week. We're also going to need to go back a week from the data that we currently have, right? So I'm going to go ahead and turn off the pipe here because I'm not ready to be plotting stuff. And so this is, again, our beginning. So maybe I'll pull this up and say beginning equaling that. And then here I can put in beginning. And then we'll also put in ending. And we'll plop this in, kind of thinking ahead to how we might generalize this to any period of time, right? And then date ending. Okay, so let's run this and make sure it works still. Good. But again, we want to go back a week. So maybe what we'll do is beginning -7. And it's not happy about that. So let's go ahead and make this a date. So we can do as.date on that, and then as.date on our ending date. And let's get all this loaded. That worked. And now we're going back a week into 2024, right? So I think we'll also want to add a year because, you know, if you're looking at this in a year, then there's going to be multiple week ones, right? You're going to have the 2025 and the 2026, and then you'll also have the week 52 from 2024 as well as 2025. So let's go ahead and add in the year, and we'll do that back up here. And so we'll do year equals year on date. So what I'd like to do is to nest my data by the week and the year, and then return the closing value for the largest date, okay? So we'll come in here again, and we'll do nest. We'll do weekly equals minus C parentheses week year. And so this is going to nest everything except week and year into a column called weekly. And weekly will be a column of data frames. And so now we see that we have these tibbles, right? But what we want to do then is for each value of weekly, we're going to do a map function to create a new column, which will be the weekly close. So we'll do mutate weekly close equals map. And we'll then take the weekly column, and I will then feed that into slice max, and we'll order by date. So it's upset because I need to put a tilde in here, and then I also need to give it the .x. And so .x is going to be each value in weekly. So now when we run that, we get a tibble back for weekly close. That's 2 values, and that's going to be the date as well as the close, right? So I then want to go ahead and pull the closing value so that we only have the closing value. But of course, that's coming back as a column of doubles that are nested. And so here I can do map underscore DBL to return that column actually as a numeric value. And so there we go. We now have the weekly close for each week. Let's go ahead and put weekly close on a separate line, and then this slice max on a separate line. And I want to get the previous week's close, right? And so one way that I could do that would be to do prev weekly close, and then I could do a lag on weekly close. Great. So now we have the previous weekly close, and again, that is being lagged by a week. And I don't care about this week 52 of 2024. I mainly want to know its closing value, right? So that I can then compare it to the closing value for the first week of 2025. However, looking at this, I see that I have a week 1 from 2024. So maybe back up here after this first filter, we can do another filter, right? And so we can see what's happening here, right? That we've got these 2 2024 days with week 1, right? So let's go ahead and add here. We could do filter, and we can then do year equals 2024 and week equals 52. We can put that in parentheses, and then we can say or year equals 2025. And so then this will skip over those 2 days from the end of December. Okay, then we can go ahead and feed this into our nest statement. Before I do that, I don't like having multiple filter statements, especially like one after the other. So let's go ahead and see if we can synthesize these together. I'm going to go ahead and copy those and comment that out. And then let's bring them together by starting with this. We'll go ahead and kind of remove those line breaks. Let's put this first part in parentheses, and then we'll do and this or this. And so I think this part where we're kind of getting rid of those last 2 days of 2024, we can go ahead and put in parentheses as kind of a joint requirement. And so now what we see is we get the same thing, but with a single filter statement. That just makes me happy. Let's go ahead and put that pipe back in. And so now when we look at this, we now see that the previous week close was 59.71 for the first week of 2025, right? And so that value is coming from this weekly close. So that's all good. Then what we could do in here is we could add another statement to our mutate function. Weekly loss equals weekly close less than prev weekly close. And so now we see that we've got our trues and our falses for indicating whether there was a weekly loss. So we still have our weekly data nested, right? That was the date as well as the daily close, right? So now what we could do would be to do unnest on weekly, and that then gets us our date and our close back, okay? And so if I were then to pipe this in, hopefully nothing has changed. So now I'm getting the end of 2024 here at the beginning, rather than starting right with 2025. And that is because I need to go ahead and drop the NA values, right? And so if I looked at my data to this point, if I go ahead and rerun this, again, remember that our prev weekly close has an NA, right? So we can solve that by coming in here and then doing drop NA on prev weekly close, pipe that in. We then lose those dates from 2024 and life is good. Now what we need to do, of course, is add in the background rectangles. So for now, we're going to go ahead and remove that pipe. And I'm going to call this S and P. And one of the things that I have been doing is I've been rerunning get symbols over and over and over again. So I'm basically hitting the Yahoo website a lot, which is not great. They might complain, but no one's complained yet, right? So I'll go ahead and put an S and P here and pipe that just to make sure everything looks good. It still does. Then what we'll do is we'll go ahead and take S and P, and I need to make a data frame from S and P to indicate the X min and the X max for each rectangle, as well as the Y min and Y max, as well as the color, right? Or a variable that will map to the color, right? So here we'll go ahead then and do a summarize, and I'll do the first as being the first date, right? And so that's going to be the min date, and then the last will be the max date, right? I guess I could have called this X min and X max, but whatever. And then we'll go ahead and do dot by equals, and we'll do it by the week and the year. This then is going to give us the week, the year, the first, and the last. I, though, need to get out of this the weekly loss, right? So we could also come in here and then do unique on weekly loss, I believe. And so we'll then call that weekly loss. It's not happy about unique because I misspelled it. U-N-I-Q-U-E. Good. And so now we've got our weekly loss indicated, right? So we could, again, clean this up. We could do select, first, last, weekly loss. I'll go ahead and save this as a data frame I'll call rectangles. And then down here, we're going to want to put the rectangles under the lines. So we'll come in before geom line and do geom underscore rect, data equals rectangles, and then AES, X min equals first, X max equals last. And then for Y min, we're going to want to put something, and Y max, we're going to want to put something. If I look at these values, why don't we set, say it like 5,000 to 6,200. And so we'll do 5,000 and 6,200. We'll come back and change these later, but this should be a pretty good start. And I forgot to add a plus to the end of this. And it's complaining because I forgot to tell it not to inherit the AES. So we'll do inherit.aes equals false. And what this means is I've got other aesthetics up here, other columns that I'm mapping to aesthetics for my geom line and geom point. Those columns are not found in my rectangles, right? I've got first, last, weekly, loss. I don't have date, close, week, right? So we'll go ahead and do that. Also in here, we need to put the fill. So I'll do fill equals weekly loss. And there we go. We now have our coloring by the weekly loss. And so one thing that I notice, if we kind of compare our rectangles here, and things look pretty gaudy, is that everything tracks except for the first week, right? And so this goes effectively false, true, false, false, where I go true, true, false, false, true, true, right? And so I think the pattern looks the same except for that first week. And so for the first week, they're saying there's not a weekly loss. I'm going to leave it in because as I calculate it, there certainly was a loss from that first week. So other than that initial week, things are coming together. Let's now go ahead and alter the color of our plot to match theirs. So using my digital color meter, I'll go ahead and grab these colors and we'll come in here and do scale, fill, manual, and we'll do breaks equals true and false, and then values. And so for true, it's going to be that orangish color. For false, it's going to be this bluish color. And then we'll go ahead and paste that in and add that. And so now we've got our orange and blue stripes matching theirs pretty well. We'll go ahead and drop the legend. I'll do that here in theme. We'll do legend.position equals none. Again, that got rid of the legend, giving us more room left to right to work with here. Let's then go ahead and think about the color of our points and line. Those are the same color, so I'll go ahead and copy that. And because it's going to be the same color for the line and points, I don't map that using the aesthetic function. So we'll do color equals that. And then we'll go ahead and copy this into geom point. And so now we've got the same color that they have. Cool, huh? Let's go ahead and add in the grid lines to match theirs. Their grid lines are on top of the rectangles, which is why I'm not going to use the theme-based approach to drawing the grid lines. I'm going to instead use geom hline. And I see that they're every 200 from 5100 to 6100. So again, that's going to go on top of everything. Actually, I should double check that. Nope, it's going to be on top of the rectangle, but behind the line and the points. So we'll do that after geom rect. We'll do geom hline, and we'll do y-intercept equals, and we'll do seek 5100, 6100 by 200s. Good. We now have our horizontal black lines. We want them to be thinner and gray, however. That's easy enough to change. We'll come back up here to geom hline. I'll do color equals gray. Let's do 80, a nice light gray, and then line width equals 0.2. So this is coming together. The body of the plot, the panel itself, looks a lot like what they have, right? Now what we have to do is add everything else to make it match theirs. But on the whole, we're doing a pretty good job of generating what they have. Let's now start with the titles, the subtitles, and the caption. So let's start by copying this text, and I'll go ahead and put that after my geom. I'll do labs, and I'll do title equals that. Then I need to put a close quote at the end of that line, and then subtitle here. And bring that up. Got that closed quote there already. Maybe if I put this on a separate line down below, it won't move over so far to the right, but whatever. It does a little bit. We'll then go ahead and do caption. Their caption says source LESG data and analytics. Mine's going to be source Yahoo, right? Because that's where I got the data from. And again, I've got my titles and I've got my caption. Now I need to play with the theming to get everything to look just right, yeah? So the first thing we want to do is move everything to be left justified on the plot rather than on the panel. The caption is right justified on the panel rather than left justified on the plot. So we'll make all those changes down here in theme, and we'll do plot.title.position equals plot. Then we'll do plot.caption.position equals plot. We'll also then do plot.caption equals element text hjust equals 0 to get that to be left justified. That pulls everything over to the left, giving us a good place to start from. So one thing I'm noticing is that we have a line break between the and global economy in the title. And so we'll go ahead and put that in with the \n. And I'm going to go ahead and change the appearance of the text. So let's start by doing text equals element text family equals Franklin. And that will make all of the text our sans serif font. Now, of course, our plot.title needs to be in the Domine serifed font, right? So we'll do element text family equals Domine. And let's go ahead and do size equals 14. We'll then do face equals bold. Get a comma at the end of the line there. And it's not super bold, but it's our Domine font. So let's go ahead and make that a bit bigger. Let's go ahead and make that say 16. And I think that is pretty good. If I put these next to each other, I see that theirs is a little bit taller than mine. And so there's some margin at the top as well as some line height, right? So let's go ahead in here and we'll do margin for the entire plot. We'll do margin. And then at the top, let's just rough in some numbers. So I'll put 10 all the way around and we'll adjust. So we'll do right equals 10, bottom equals 10, and then left equals 10. And I put margin, it's probably supposed to be plot.margin. And so now we can see things kind of pulled in a little bit from the edge. Let's go ahead and increase the line height for our title. So we'll do line height equals 1.1. And we can then see that that gave us some spacing between those lines. So I think the title is in good shape. Now let's turn to the subtitle. I'm going to put orange bars in orange and bold using element markdown from the GG text package. So let's go ahead and load that. Come back up to the top here and do library GG text. Get that loaded. And then for plot.subtitle, we'll do element markdown. And again, family will be Domine. Good, so now we have that serifed font. One thing I'm noticing is that I think our left margin is a little bit too big compared to theirs. So again, we can do that very easily down here. And let's make that left, say 7. All right, so I think that is better. Now let's turn our attention back to the subtitle. So I'm going to go ahead and make orange bars orange and bold. Let's grab our digital color meter and figure out the color of that orange. And maybe if I zoom in a little bit, it'll be easier to get a good placement on this. So go ahead and copy that color. And then we'll come back up to subtitle. And in here, I'm going to do a span. We'll then do style equals, and then I'll put in single quotes, color, colon, that hexadecimal code, and then a closing quote and a closing brace. Also put in 2 stars, which is markdown for bold. And then we'll put 2 stars to the right of bars. And then we'll back out of the span tag. And so now we see we have orange bars, right? So it's, again, not nearly as bold as I would like it to be, but that's okay. We now need to change the size of the font, I think the color of the font, and the margin around the font. Let's go ahead and maybe shrink the size of the font just a smidge. So let's go ahead and do size equals 10. I say just a smidge. I don't know what the actual size is, so I'll go to 10 and then we'll adjust. And did I get that right on the first try? So if we look at the position of the subtitles, I think 10 is pretty good. It's a little bit longer than their subtitle, but I think it looks pretty good. So the next thing I want to change is the color of the font. Theirs is a grayish color, whereas mine is the same black as the title. You can then do color equals gray 30. And I think that is a pretty good match. Great. And so now we want to change the margin around the top and the bottom of the subtitle. Okay. So let's place that there. And we'll go ahead then, and for plot subtitle, I'll do margin equals margin. Let's do T equals 20, B equals 20. Again, just to kind of rough things in, and then we can adjust. And so that brought down orange bars a bit. One thing I'm feeling is that the title is not perhaps at the same line height or position at the bottom edge. So maybe we'll go ahead and increase the line height just a hair to 1.2. And so now that we've got that in place, then it's easier to adjust the margin between the subtitle and the title. So it can increase just a hair. Again, at the top we have 20. Let's take that to 22. Okay, let's knock that to 23. And now what we want to think about is the margin between the subtitle and the top of the plot. And I put in a Y limit value, right, drawing these rectangles, but there's padding around the top and bottom of the plot. So let's go ahead and turn off that padding, that expansion, so that I can better see where the top of the plot is, right? And maybe after scale fill manual, I'll do chord Cartesian, and we'll do expand equals false, clip equals off. And so now we can kind of see better the top edge of the plot. And I see that maybe the margin is a little bit too big between the subtitle and the plot itself. And so again, we had 20. Let's take that to say 18. That draws that up. Let me kind of do this crosshair trick. If I drag that across, I think that's like right on. I think that's good. All right. So now turning our attention to the caption in the lower left corner, that font I believe is too big. And it's also maybe too dark a black. So let's go ahead and shrink that. And so we'll come down here to plot caption and we'll do size equals 8. And I think that does a pretty good job of matching the size of the font. There's a bit too much margin between the bottom of source and the bottom of the plot. So let's go ahead and bring that down. I made that 10. Let's go ahead and make it 8. I think that does pretty well. Great. And then we'll go ahead and do color equals gray 30. Now let's go ahead and get rid of the X and Y axis titles. And we can do that back up here. We could do it in labs, but I'm going to be removing a lot of stuff from the axis. So we'll go ahead and do axis.title equals element blank. Of course, that gets rid of the axis titles. Let's go ahead and get rid of those tick marks. So we can also do axis.ticks equals element blank. And now we've gotten rid of those tick marks. One thing I noticed now that I kind of look at the plot more, we removed some space from the bottom between the caption and the bottom of the plot. That moved everything down. So maybe we can remove some of the space from the top of the plot now to kind of move things back up. And again, that was in plot margin. We went from 10 to 8. And so let's go from 10 to 8 on the top. That gets things lined up better, and that looks great. Before we move on to thinking about these axes more, I want to go ahead and put in some space between the top of my caption and the bottom of the plot, right? So let's go ahead and add margin to the top of the caption. And again, we've seen how to do this. We can do margin equals margin T, and let's try 20. And I'll notice that everything at the top stayed in the same position, but we then got some more spacing between the caption and the bottom of the plot. So we can go up a bit further. Let's go ahead and say 25. All right, let's go up to say 30. That is actually pretty good. Let's do this crosshair trick again. Go up maybe a little bit more. So let's take it up to say 32. I think that is perfect. Now what I want to do is go ahead and play with the y-axis. So let's start by changing the breaks, right? So currently ggplot is picking it for us, going every 250. We want it to go every 200 to match our grid lines. After chord Cartesian, I'll do scale y continuous, and then we'll do breaks equals, and we'll do a seek from 5100 to 6100 by 200. And then that gets our breaks positioned right. But now we want to format the labels to have a comma. Coming back to our scale y continuous, we can then do labels equals, and I'm going to use a function from the scales function. So we'll do label number. And if we run it like that, we then get a space between like the thousands and the hundreds position. We want to put a comma there, right? And so to do that, we can give the label number function an argument, which will be big.mark. And so big mark is the marking to indicate a big break, like in the thousands position. And so there we will put a comma, and now we get a comma, right, placed for our y-axis text, right? I want to play now with the limits on the y-axis. And so you'll recall that I put in some y-axis limits. And I think what I'd like to do is to set that algorithmically, right? And so where did I do that? I did that here with ymin and ymax, right? I hard-coded those values. So let's go ahead and do ymin equals something and ymax equals something. And so then here I'll put ymin and here I'll put ymax. And so I'm going to calculate ymin and ymax, right? And so what we can do is we can take S&P. So I can look at the max of S&P $close to get that value of 6144, right? And then I can multiply that by a number, or I can add a value, right? So let's try multiplying it by a number. So we'll go ahead and take that. And I'm realizing that some people are probably out there yelling, you could do that with the expand function. But to me, that seems a little bit, I don't know, not so intuitive how to use the expand function. It's easier for me to calculate it here. So let's do like 1.01 times the max function. So if I do this, or what is 0.01 times this? So if I do times 0.01, then it's going to increase it by 61. All right, so let's try that. And then down here, we could do 0.99 times the min on S&P $close. And I feel like that is a bigger gap than I had before. So let's go ahead and shrink it. And maybe what I could do would be to say like gap. And before I had like 0.01. And then I could do, in parentheses here, 1 plus gap. Here I could then do 1 minus gap. And again, we don't want 0.01. Let's try 0.005. And so that actually, I think, does a pretty good job of matching the position. So if I grab this point, which is the max, and grab that over, it's a little bit high, but not by much. And it's pretty consistent. And in fact, I feel like somehow my plot got a little bit higher. So I think if I put some space between the title and the subtitle, that'll come back down. So let's try that. So again, with our subtitle, if I put on the bottom then 19, my grid lines then line up pretty nicely with theirs, and I think that's great. Okay, so now we have the y-axis set. Now we need to think about the x-axis, right? And so first of all, I notice that they do have some spacing to the left and right, and we'll then do scale x date, right? And then we'll have limits, and we're going to put in 2 limits. So we're going to start with the initial start date, which let's go ahead and do min on date, right? So we can do min on S&P $date, and that I believe is going to be January 2nd, right? And so we could take that minus 2. So to go back 2 days, which should then be December 31st of 24. Cool, right? And so then our other limit, the upper limit, right, will then be max on S&P date plus 2. And then we'll put a plus at the end of this. Well, that doesn't look right, yeah? So let's come back up to scale x date, limits, min. Oh, because I used min, I need max. All right. So nothing still changed, and I'm noticing I got my parentheses wrong here. So let's go ahead and try that again. There we go. And so now we see that we have a bit of the line going off to the left and right. And I think that going that 2 days did a pretty nice job. Okay, now we want to work with the x-axis text, right? So currently we have only the month, right? And instead we want the day, and I think I'm then going to add the month as a separate annotation. So let's go ahead and put in the dates we want. And so again, we'll come back up to scale x date, and we'll then do breaks, and we'll do a C function, and it's going to start at January 6th and go to the end, basically, in 2-week chunks, right? So again, we could do 2025-0106. And I'm going to take this out of C, and I'm going to do seek on that. And then let's go to max S&P date, and we'll then do that by 14 days. So let's see what this actually gives us. I think it should give us dates that are every 2 weeks. And it's not happy because I think this is probably a character. So let's go ahead and put this as .date. So let's go ahead and try that. Very good. Now we've got all of the dates every 2 weeks, right? So we see 1/6, 1/22/3, 6/23. Cool, right? So that's going to be our breaks. And then our labels. So actually, I'm not going to use labels. I'm going to use date underscore labels. And so there's special formatting that you can use to label the dates, and I never remember them. So let's look at the help, scale X date. And we can see that there's date labels here, right? And so if I scroll down, let's see the help for date labels. And so it says a string giving the formatting specification for the labels. Codes are defined in strf time. So I'll click on that and let's scroll down, and we can see that in format, it's a character string with this odd notation. So we want to know the notation to get the day of the month, right? And so we can see that capital A is a full weekday name, abbreviated weekday name, so forth, right? So %D is day of the month as a decimal from 01 to 31. I don't want that 0. I'd rather have nothing or space. And so I think what we want is %E, the day of the month as a decimal number, 1 to 31, with a leading space for a single digit number. In here then, we'll put quote %E. That then gives us our date of the month, right? And we could probably have a little bit more space between that number and the bottom of the plot. So let's go ahead and do that here real quick. We'll do axis.text.x equals element text. And then we'll do margin equals margin. And T, let's do 5. So that added space above the number, but that added space to the overall bottom, right? So I added, I think, enough space. So I think I need then to remove 5 from the caption. So let's take this from 32 down to 27, and that lines things up. Maybe 5 is too much. So let's go ahead and take this to 3 and this to 29. And I think that is going to be good. And now what we want to do is go ahead and put in the month underneath. And so to do that, I'm going to use geom text. And so to use geom text, we need to make another data frame, right? And so I'm going to take S and P, and we're going to pipe that to a filter. And so the specific dates aren't consistent, right? So it's like February 3rd, March 3rd, but January 6th. January 3rd is in the data, but for whatever reason, they didn't want to include that, right? So I'm going to basically filter for January 6th, February 3rd, and March 3rd. So we'll come in here and we'll do date %in, and then we're going to give it the dates we want, right? And so we'll do 2025, 01, 06, 2025, 02, 03, 2025, 03, 03. And so again, that gives us those 3 dates, which we're going to need for placing January, February, March, right? So that will work. Also, I'm kind of thinking ahead to if we want to expand to like the present day, this will also work because this will also give us kind of the following months, right? Although I guess I'd have to kind of hard code in the month I'd want. Anyway, I won't worry about that right now. So that is going to get us the date, and I'm going to then create a column called month. So I'll do mutate month equals month on date. And so we then see we get 1, 2, 3. We can give this a ABBR equals true to then get us abbreviation, I thought, but maybe I'm misremembering. So if I look at the help for month, label. So abbreviation by default is true, but we want label to be true, and that gets us January, February, March. Cool. Then I'll go ahead and put this as month label. And to clean things up, let's go ahead and do a select on date and month. And then we'll go ahead and grab month label, and we'll put this at the very bottom. So we'll do geom underscore text, and then we'll do data equals month label, AES. So X is going to be the date. Y, we're going to have to hard code or algorithmically code. So for now, I'm going to put it at 5,000. And then label is going to be month. And then we're going to want to do the inherit.aes equals false. We now have our January, February, March. And I'm noticing that it is putting it underneath the plot. And it's basically moving the plot up. And that is because we didn't set the y-axis limits on our plot. And so we can do that back up here in chord Cartesian, right? So I can then come in here, so I can then do ylim, and then the values I recall calling ymin and ymax. And I just noticed that I totally flipped my axes, which makes me wonder if I put things in the wrong order here. What is y min and y max? Ah, I very well must have flipped this. All right. So this is y max and y min. See if that breaks anything else. Nope, that looks good. And everything still lines up. And so we then need to move our month title down a bit. So I put it in at 5,000, but let's go ahead and put like month Y, and then we'll then take Y min and multiply that, say, by 0.99, and then that month Y will be the placement here, right? So instead of 5,000, we'll put month Y. So that's basically what we started with. So let's go ahead and bump that a bit, right? So 0.97. So that moves it down, maybe too far. Let's take that up to say 0.98. And that's a pretty good placement. But we need to match the size of the font as well as the font, because it's still using an Arial font rather than the Franklin font, because even though we have defined the family equals Franklin here in theme, that doesn't hold for geom text. So we'll do that very easily here. We'll do family equals Franklin. Size, I don't know. Let's just start with 8 and do size.unit equals pt. That shrinks it down. I think it's perhaps too small relative to the number. So let's take that back up to say 9. Put it in the wrong place. All right, so that's much better. And I think that looks really good. And I think we have done a pretty good job of matching their plot and our plot. I'm noticing that their lines are perhaps a little bit thicker than my lines. So let's come back up to geom line. We can then do line width equals 1. Maybe that's too thick. So let's go ahead and take it down to say 0.75. Great. So we have recreated their version of the plot, right? And so I'm happy with the way this looks. However, it's been a month and we have 4 more weeks of data. And so we might wonder, how could we change our code to update this with kind of real-time data, right? And so let's try that now. And so let's think about how we could possibly change this, okay? And so the ending we set here. So one thing that we could do is to change the ending to be today. And let's comment out that as date. And so if you're not familiar with today, that returns the date for today in the ISO notation. So let's go ahead and run all this and see where that gets us just by changing that one thing, right? And so now what we see, right, is that we've got the rest of the data. Actually, was that the only thing I needed to change? That'd be pretty slick, right? Actually, it's not the only thing we need to change, because we don't have anything in here for April, right? So it'd be good to put April under, say, like the 14th. If I was doing this for real, right, I might put a number under like the first day of the first week of the month or something like that. Or maybe I would have it be like the 1st and the 15th of each month or something like that. But anyway, I think this is probably good enough. Let's go ahead and put a label under April 14th. And otherwise, I think I somehow managed to not hard code everything and algorithmically plug in the data. So that's pretty slick that I only had to change one little thing. So let's come back up. And again, where we have our month label, we have January, February, March. We have all the data, of course, but we need to plug in here then 2025, 04, 14, and that gets us April, right? Very easily. And maybe it's a little bit too close to the number. We could perhaps increase that a little bit, and that we set with the month Y. So let's maybe make this 0.978. This is really cool, and again, hopefully highlights the value of not hard coding. I have been criticized by some people in comments for hard coding a lot of things, and sometimes I hard code things because, well, it's just a little bit easier and not having to worry about future data, right? And so I won't promise that this doesn't break with future data getting added. I think it does a pretty good job of responding when we get more data. And so I'm pretty happy with the way this looks and the way it came together. Let me know what you think. So how do we interpret this plot? Well, I think what was clear, and the reason this plot was made, was because a lot of Trump's policies and things he was talking about had a lot of uncertainty and a lot of confusion and fear was building into the markets, right? And so when he announced the big tariffs at the beginning of April, we saw this crash in the S&P 500. It dropped more than 10%. It had already been dropping from its high over the course of the Trump presidency. I think from here to here was about like a 9% drop. And it dropped even further, dropped like 10% in 2 days. And then the tariffs were rolled back, things rebounded, and then have been fairly volatile ever since because Trump is pretty volatile and people are uncertain what's going on. But the last week and a half or so, at least as a measure of the economy, the S&P 500, things have been rebounding and things are not quite back to where they were before, but certainly doing a lot better than they were at the beginning of April. Well, let me know what you think about this visualization. Let me know what you think about how we have been able to generalize the code to basically update this plot in a year. And hopefully, if we do run this again in a year, it'll work. But hey, we'll see. And if it doesn't, you know what? We can adjust the code and we can just try to make it more and more generalizable as we continue to work with it. So that's all I have for today. Please be sure that you've liked and subscribed this video. Please tell your friends what we're doing here on YouTube, and I will see you next time for another episode of Code Club.